The first thing they noticed about Sergeant Delacroix was her hands. Not her height, though that came second, always, and not the way she carried her rifle case like it weighed nothing, which it didn't, not to her. The hands, small, careful, the kind of hands that looked like they belonged behind a desk, somewhere in Ottawa, filling out requisition forms. Not here. Not on a forward operating base in the Kandahar basin with 43 degrees of heat pressing down on everything like a physical object. Staff Sergeant Ohlsen was the one who said it out loud. He usually was. They sent us a sparrow, he said, not quietly enough, to nobody in particular and everybody within earshot. A few of the men didn't laugh. A few of them did. Corporal Tamblin, who was from Medicine Hat and had a sister who'd done 2 tours with the RKF, looked at his boots. Private Strelkov looked somewhere else entirely. Delacroix heard it. She always heard things. That was in fact the point. She set her case down on the rack in the equipment room and unlatched it without looking up. The Barrett .50 cal inside was not standard issue. It was not the kind of thing you carried unless you knew exactly what you were doing with it. And knowing what you were doing with a Barrett at distance meant something specific about the person holding it. Ohlsen glanced at the case. His expression didn't change, but something shifted underneath it. She didn't introduce herself. The orders had done that. What the orders hadn't done was explain why Command had attached a Canadian Forces sharpshooter to a Ranger element that had been running hot for 6 weeks straight, on a rotation that was supposed to end in 11 days. That explanation came from Major Vance, who had the particular quality of a man who delivered bad news the way other men delivered weather reports. "The Valley Corridor," he said, pointing to the topographical map on the table. His finger traced a line between 2 ridges that looked, on paper, like a throat. "We've had 2 elements ambushed here in the past month. Same configuration both times. Elevated position, south-facing slope, distance between 800 and 1,200 meters. The shooter knows what he's doing, and he's patient. We haven't been able to locate the position because by the time we get eyes on the slope, there's nothing there." He paused. "Delacroix is going to find him." The room was not silent, exactly, but whatever was being said in it went quiet. Ohlsen had his arms crossed. He was looking at Delacroix the way a man looks at something he doesn't understand and has decided not to try. "With respect, sir," Ohlsen said, "we've had 3 recon elements work that slope." "I know," Vance said. Delacroix. She was already studying the map. She didn't look up when she spoke. "The south-facing slope is wrong. The sightlines from south would give you the ambush geometry, but the wind in that corridor runs northeast in the afternoon. Anyone shooting at that range in afternoon heat with a northeast wind from a south-facing position is fighting the ballistics the whole time." She put her finger on the map. "Not the south slope. The north ridge, set back, elevated. Here. The angle's steeper, but the wind's behind the shot. You can hold a position there for hours. Nothing moves up there. No patrol routes. Nobody's looking. Silence." Ohlsen looked at the map, then at Vance, then, almost involuntarily, back at the map. "The north ridge is 2,000 meters from the corridor," Tamblin said. It wasn't an objection. It was the start of doing the math. 1,800 at the closest point, Delacroix said. "Doable." She said it, the way she might say the coffee's ready. A statement of fact about the physical world, nothing more. The insertion was scheduled for 300, and the team was 6. Delacroix, Ohlsen, Tamblin, Strelkov, a medic named Pasternak who'd been in the basin so long he'd stopped noticing the heat, and Corporal Brienne, who was quiet in the way that meant he was paying attention to everything. They left the wire in darkness, moving without lights, and the mountain came up around them in stages. First the flat ground, then the loose rock, then the serious climb that nobody had talked about in the briefing because everybody already knew. Delacroix carried her own case. Ohlsen had offered once back at the wire in the kind of voice that made the offer feel like a test. She'd said no without breaking stride. He hadn't asked again. The North Ridge was 3 hours on foot, and the last hour was vertical enough that the rifle case became its own problem. Shifting her center of gravity on every handhold, she adjusted. She'd been adjusting for this particular problem since she was 26 years old, and had first carried a long gun up the training slopes at Valcartier in January, ice on every surface, instructors who'd expected her to quit by the second hour. She hadn't quit then. The expectation that she might had stopped affecting her by the 3rd year of doing it. Ohlsen caught up to her on a ledge about 40 minutes from the summit. He was breathing harder than she was, which she noticed, and he noticed her noticing. "You done this before," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "Afghanistan twice," she said. Molly, one other place. Which other place? One other place. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she'd learned, over years, to read correctly. Not hostility anymore, or not only that. Something more like recalibration. They kept climbing. The position was exactly where she'd said it would be. She found the sign on the ground before anyone else saw it. A depression in the loose rock that wasn't natural. The kind of thing that looks like nothing until you've spent enough time looking for it. A position someone had used more than once. Packed just slightly harder than the rock around it. A clean line of sight that opened up as she traced it forward, down through the throat of the valley. Tamblyn crouched beside her. "That's him," he said quietly. "That's been him," she said. "He's not here now. He was here 3 days ago, maybe 4. He'll come back." "How do you know he'll come back?" "Because it's a perfect position, and he knows it. People come back to perfect positions." She sat up while it was still dark. The Barrett on its bipod adjusted for the angle. She ran the ballistics in her head because that was faster than the app, and because she'd been doing this long enough that the numbers lived in a specific part of her memory that was very quiet and very cold and very reliable. Wind from the northeast at this elevation, probably 12 to 15 kilometers per hour by midday. Temperature rising. Light conditions shifting hard from 0800 onwards. The sun moving across the valley in a way that would change the shimmer off the rock faces at the far end. She noted all of it and said nothing to anyone because none of it required saying. She just adjusted. Ohlsen watched her work without speaking, which she appreciated. He had, she thought, the particular quality of a man who could tell when he'd been wrong about something and was quietly revising without making it anyone's business. They waited. The waiting was the part nobody filmed, she thought, not for the first time. The part nobody put in the briefings or the training videos or the recruitment materials. 6 people on a cold rock in the dark, each of them managing the same equation. Stay alert without burning through everything you have, because the burning is the problem. Discipline wasn't loudness. It wasn't certainty. It was the ability to sit in a situation that contained no information and not start manufacturing information to fill the gap. Strelkov fell asleep, which was correct. Pasternak did too. Brienne stayed awake and read something on a small device. The screen dimmed to almost nothing. Ohlsen sat with his back against the rock and looked at the valley and occasionally looked at Delacroix. And she was aware of his looking but didn't respond to it because there was nothing to respond to yet. Tamblyn, at some point around 0430, moved close enough to speak quietly without it carrying. "Can I ask you something?" She didn't look away from the scope. "You can. The Molly thing. That was the operation near Kandahar?" A pause. "Why? I was there. Different element. We were on the eastern approach when the secondary position fired." She turned her head slightly and looked at him. He had the look of a man placing a face he'd been trying to place for a while. "The secondary was 900 meters, she said. "I know. We didn't think it was possible from that angle." "It was possible from that angle." "I know," he said. "I know that now." He went back to his position. There was something between them after that. Not warmth exactly, but the specific kind of acknowledgement that doesn't need to be named to be real. She turned back to the valley and the waiting resumed. He appeared at 0847. Not from the path, that was the first thing. Not from any of the routes that a patrol planner would expect, which was how he'd done this before, and how he expected to do it again. He came up from the east, using a dry creek bed that would have been invisible on the topographical maps, and was only visible now because Delacroix had spent 2 hours of darkness watching the terrain until she understood it the way you understand a room you've lived in. Not analytically, but bodily, at the level where you notice when something changes before you can say what changed. She saw him when he was still 200 meters below the position. She didn't say anything for 30 seconds. She tracked him, moving the scope with the careful slowness of someone who has learned that urgency at this stage is how you make mistakes. She confirmed what she was seeing. She confirmed it again. Then she said quietly, "North Ridge, 200 meters below us, east approach." Moving slowly. He's done this before. Ohlsen was on the radio before she finished speaking. Tamblyn moved to a secondary position. Strelkov was up immediately and without noise, which told her something good about him. Pasternak and Brienne held back at the instruction, because the call Ohlsen was making was the call about whether this became a capture or something else, and that decision wasn't theirs to make on the rock. The call took 4 minutes. Delacroix tracked the figure the entire time, watched him climb, watched him settle into the position below with the confidence of someone who has never been found there. He set up his own weapon system. He was looking at the valley corridor, which was currently empty, because the element that was supposed to move through it had been held at the wire for exactly this reason. She heard Ohlsen finish the call. "Delacroix," he said. She already knew what he was going to say. She knew it in the same way she knew the wind and the temperature and the precise distance to the position below. "Take it," he said. She took it. The debrief was the following afternoon, in the same room with the same map, and Major Vance ran it in his weather report voice, because that was how he ran everything. The sniper had been identified. The valley corridor was clear. The two elements that had been held at the wire completed their movement without incident. No Canadian or Allied casualties for the first time in 6 weeks of operations in that sector. Ohlsen spoke twice in the debrief, once to confirm his timeline of events, which he did accurately and without editorializing. Once, near the end, when Vance was wrapping up, he said something that was not required by the format of the debrief and not particularly typical of him. He said, "The position identification was Sergeant Delacroix's call from the initial briefing. All of it. She put us in the right place and she kept us there. The outcome is hers." Vance looked at him for a moment. Then he made a note. Then he moved on. Delacroix, from across the table, said nothing. She had long since stopped needing the acknowledgement in the room where it happened. She'd learned, over years, that the acknowledgement that meant something came later and quietly, in the way people moved around you differently, stood next to you instead of across from you, asked your read on a situation before they asked anyone else's. That happened faster than she'd expected this time. She wasn't sure if that was the sector, the team, or just her getting older and less interested in waiting for it. Probably all three. 3 days after the debrief, she was sitting outside the medical tent at ZO 600, coffee in hand, watching the light change over the mountains to the west. The way it came in stages here, gray, then a kind of dark gold, then the full flat brightness that would last all day, was something she'd noticed in every theater she'd worked in. Light did different things in different places. In the Kandahar basin, it came in fast, like it was trying to get somewhere. Tamblyn sat down next to her without asking, which was, she'd decided, a good quality in a person. "Heading back to Shiloh next week," he said. "Manitoba," she said. "You?" "Valcartier." Eventually, he nodded. They watched the light for a while. "The Cadal question," he said. "I was going to ask you something else. The angle on the secondary position. I ran the numbers after. The crosswind that day was 11 kilometers from the southwest," she said, "gusting to 17 near the ridgeline." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you hold for that and hit what you're trying to hit?" "You don't hold for it," she said. "You account for it. There's a difference. Holding for something means you're fighting the conditions. Accounting for it means the conditions are just information." He thought about that. "Huh," he said, which was the kind of response that meant it had actually landed. She finished her coffee. The mountains had gone from dark gold to something close to white at the peaks, the light hitting the rock and scattering in ways that would make visibility a problem by 0900. She noted it without particularly caring about it, the way she noted most things. Because information was information, and the day when you stopped collecting it was the day the situation stopped being yours to understand. "You should sleep," she said. "You've been up since SU 200. So have you." "I sleep differently," she said. That was true, as far as it went. She slept in the way she did everything else. Efficiently, without excess, with the particular quality of attention that let her come back up to full alertness. In the time it took most people to figure out they'd been woken up. It was a thing she developed and then refined over a decade and a half of doing this, and she was no longer sure whether it was a skill or just who she was now. Tamblyn stood up. He looked at the mountains for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said. She waited. "I'm sorry I was looking at my boots when Ohlsen said what he said at the beginning. I should have said something then." She looked at him. She thought about what to do with that, which didn't take long. "You were looking at your boots because you knew it was wrong, and you weren't sure what to do about it," she said. "That's not the same thing as agreeing with it." He nodded slowly. "Next time," she said, "you'll know what to do about it." He went back inside. The mountains had gone fully bright now, and the day was arranging itself the way days do in that part of the world. Too hot, too flat, full of information that most people would miss. She sat with it for a while longer, letting it come in, not hurrying any of it. There was, she knew, another briefing at ZO 900, a different valley, A different problem. A different set of people in a room who might or might not have read her file, might or might not know what she could do, would have their first impression and form their first judgment in the 30 seconds after she walked through the door. She'd been through enough of those rooms. Now that the judgment had stopped feeling like something that happened to her and started feeling like something she let pass by, the way you let a win pass by when you've already accounted for it. She picked up her coffee cup. It was empty. That was fine. There was more inside.